are stardust. We are golden, and we got to get ourselves back to the
I love that Joni Mitchell song, how it says, we are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. I love how it combines both this scientific evolutionary idea of creation, that we come from the stars, and also that biblical sense of we've got to get ourselves back to the garden, as in the book of Genesis, this idea of the Garden of Eden, and that we're on a journey to get back to creating a kind of paradise, some kind of harmony or peace here on earth. All people throughout time and space have had some creation stories. There are so many different creation stories. I was talking to a woman this week, and she has on her phone a book of Native American creation stories. There's a few dozen creation stories from different Native American peoples just on this continent. It's a few dozen of the over 100 creation stories that existed here on this continent before people started coming from all over the world bringing a whole bunch more. There are thousands of creation stories representing thousands of cultures and religions, and each one uses the flora and the fauna of the place that it comes from to describe how the world came to be. So North American creation stories have in them often buffalo or rabbits or deer. And in the Middle East, the stories have sheep and shepherds and pharaohs. And in Asia, they have elephants and monkeys and lotus flowers. In a sense, we all need a creation story. We need some way to understand where we came from, who we are, and where we're going. What's unique about our generations is that we are the first to know that we actually are stardust. That literally the atoms that make up our bodies are from the stars. The stars are our ancestors. We know that the hydrogen that exists in the universe, all of the hydrogen that exists in the universe was created 13 billion years ago. And our bodies are over 70% H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. That means that a large percentage of our atoms in our bodies are 13 billion years old. And you thought you were old when you walked in here this morning. We know now that the carbon and the oxygen that exists all around us and in us was formed from exploding giant red stars. We are made of star stuff. These images on the screen from the Hubble telescope it's like a family album. These are our ancestors. As my colleague Forrest Church said, the world was pregnant with us in the moment it all began. All the raw materials that existed in the first moment of creation, and it's all been forming and reforming into itself in over billions of years. The hydrogen and other atoms in our bodies were once in dinosaurs, and who knows what other amazing and maybe disgusting creatures these atoms have belonged to. And they've now come to be formed in this unique way to be you and me for what's really a short blip on the screen of time. As Michael Dowd says, you and I are not separate from the universe. We are expressions of the universe. And you must ask yourself, how is the universe expressing itself through you? He explains that when the first man floated above the earth and looked down at the earth, it was not man looking at earth. It was the first time earth became complex enough to be able to push a piece of itself far enough away that earth could look back on itself. We are not separate from nature, but emerged out of nature and the earth and the stars and the planets. And nature's been growing in complexity from the very beginning, and only recently it's become complex enough to be aware of where we came from. And for the first time to become aware of ourselves as part of everything and deeply connected. We're not just the relatives of the monkeys, we're the relatives of broccoli and zucchini, and we share DNA with all of them. We are the earth looking in the mirror. We are creation finally conscious of itself. The cosmologist and author Brian Swim says 4 billion years ago the earth was molten rock, and now it sings opera. When the Bible says in Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 that Adam was formed from the earth, it's an early understanding of the fact that we emerged out of the earth. It's a storytelling way of explaining that we are part and substance of creation. According to Swim, you take a great cloud of hydrogen gas and you just leave it alone, and in time it becomes rose bushes, giraffes, and human beings. Well, some would debate whether it was left alone or whether there was some force that made things happen. Now, I've read a lot of creation stories, but the story of evolution has to be the greatest creation story of them all. It has the potential as well to be a unifying creation story for all people. There's the scientific and physical story of creation, and then there are the various cultural stories that have emerged around the world and across time that have helped people in various cultures and various languages to make sense of their world and to pass on their culture and their values to the next generation. If people were to accept evolution as the physical and factual creation story, then all the other religious and cultural stories no longer have to be in competition about which one is true. In a sense, they're all valid, in that they are all cultural expressions that are filled with rich stories and wisdom and poetry and values. They help us understand the creation of evil and suffering and all kinds of things that science doesn't really offer us much information about or understanding of. One of the things that's really nice about evolution is that unlike the other creation stories, which are fixed, the scientific creation story changes as we discover more about our world. When we find fossils and make discoveries, the story adapts to include them. I have to say, probably one of the most bizarre moments of my ministry was when we had a major public debate here in Tulsa about putting a Christian creationism exhibit in the Tulsa Public Zoo. You remember that? At this debate, there were various strong evangelical Christian voices. There were others like myself and scientists and professors trying to say, no, this doesn't make sense. And so the question came up. Somebody spoke about dinosaur bones not being in the creation story of and the various other things that didn't exist. And so one of these folks who was pushing for this fundamentalist Christian view was asked, what about the dinosaurs and the fossils, and how could they be compatible with a 6,000-year-old earth and creation? And the man said, we all know that God planted those things in the earth in order to test our faith. I thought, where am I? Where have I come? I thought I was like transported back to the Scopes trial or something. I thought this was the 21st century. The problem with believing in the various religious creation stories as fact is that they require people to come up with these tortured answers like that in order to, when new information comes to light. Whereas the evolutionary story, it's still emerging as we learn more, and it's a great story because it's not over, and we're a part of it. It's not something that happened, it's something that's happening. The great creation story called evolution is still being told, and we're a part of it, and it transcends cultural differences and religious affiliations. The story was not given to one people in one time, in one place, in one language, who were told to spread it all over the world. It's truly the story of all humanity and animals and plants and stars. Amazingly, what we're discussing about carbon atoms and oxygen atoms coming from great giant red stars has only been known for about 60 years. So we are some of the first humans to know of our complete connection to the stars and to one another. Scientists, author and friend of mine, Connie Barlow, reminds us that for ages and ages, people thought that the stars were pinpricked holes in the firmament of the sky through which the light of God shined through to us at night. Throughout time, people have been trying to understand the world around them, and they used what they knew to describe it. But we are the first generation. They have the Hubble telescope and other telescopes and technology which helped us to see the galaxy is over 12 billion years old. What's crazy is that we're not even seeing what exists right now. What we see, a lot of what we're seeing are 12 billion years ago. We now know that when we look up at the North Star in the night sky, that we realize it could have burned out in the 14th century, and news of it just hasn't reached us yet. We now know that the light that comes from the closest star in our night sky, Alpha Centauri, when it reaches our eyes, began its journey 4 years ago. That's the closest star. It takes 4 years traveling at the speed of light to arrive to our eyes. Some of the farthest ones that we can see still with our naked eyes at night began their journey more than 1 million years ago. As far as we know, they could be long gone. When we consider the incredible vastness of this universe, it warrants humility. It reminds us how ridiculous it really is for people to be arguing over whose scripture contains the truth about the nature of existence. We know now that there are millions of stars in the sky for each one person on the earth. So if we multiply the millions of stars by the billions of people, this universe is extraordinarily huge. And here we are on this tiny, very small blue marble that is floating in infinite space, and we're these infinitesimal specks of dust on this marble who live for a very short amount of time in the scheme of things, and we find ourselves arguing over whose ancient story that was created before we had a telescope or a microscope explains it all correctly and accurately. Our hubris is almost as large as the universe. What is so liberating and so hopeful about the evolutionary story is that it's humble, in that we know we don't have it all figured out. And it doesn't claim that any one group is chosen or any one group is saved. And another thing is that the question of God is neither denied nor confirmed by this story. And so there's room in this story for agnostics as well as theists, for mystics and skeptics as well as believers. The fear of religious fundamentalists is that if people stop believing in God, that they'll become immoral and unjust, and that violence will become the norm. Now, there's a kind of cognitive dissonance in that perspective, because many of these religions have been in place for centuries, despite people's belief in God and often belief in their religions. We have seen plenty of wars, domination, oppression, and violence. So belief in God and religion has certainly not rid the world of violence and injustice. In fact, it's often promoted it. So the question for today is, whether there are ways that the story of evolution can help inspire people to live more peaceful and moral and equitable lives. And I can think of 3 ways that the evolutionary view can lead us to a more just and peaceful world. First, with evolution, we understand ourselves as part of the whole of existence. We cannot deny our utter dependence and interconnectedness with all of life. I think it's trying to emerge right now. Something new is evolving. So accepting that reality could lead people to be more caring of the environment, knowing that we are part and parcel of everything and everyone, more caring of one another and the animals and the species that exist in this world. They are our relatives. We are all one and part of this great creation. Second, we can see ourselves as co-creators of the world. As human beings, we help to create as well and evolve different kinds of ways of being. We help to create governments and buildings, bridges, the internet, poetry, churches and children, gas chambers, implements of torture, weapons of mass destruction, cluster bombs, and mass graves. We have the power to create things that support life and dignity, and we also have the power to create things that destroy life and rob people and demean their dignity. It's an incredible responsibility. But we're not just participants in this world. We are helping to create this world that we live in. And third, the story of evolution is the story of cooperation, maybe most importantly. The way that the exploding stars turn into people who love and who learn is a story of how at each stage of development, those parts of existence learned to cooperate. The ones that learn to cooperate and become in more and more complex forms and structures are the ones that survived, and the other ones often died out. Imagine that there was a time when all that existed were single cell, or just keep this real simple, single cell organisms, and then there was some change in the temperature of the climate and they couldn't survive. And so some of these single cell organisms buddied up with some other organisms and created multiple cell organisms, and the ones that could cooperate and get along with others and live together continued to exist in the new reality, in the new climate, and then others died out. And this continued to happen because over these billions of years, there's been or the 4.5 billion years of Earth, there have been one crisis over the next in the environment, in the atmosphere, what gases, what oxygen, what temperature the Earth was. And so the things that could cooperate and become more and more complex are the ones that survive. This also happens in society, in human society. First we had, people had their families, and then eventually, organizing into clans, and then organizing into tribes, and eventually into nations. As more and more people formed into larger, more complex relationships of cooperation. What an evolutionary mindset calls us to do is to learn to cooperate at higher and higher levels as a means of survival. Nations have been forming into multinational bodies, the largest one so far being the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. And then the various climate change accords come out of this kind of international cooperation. More and more space exploration is being done together with other nations. Even nations that are otherwise not real friendly down here on Earth are cooperating in space. These are signs of the development of our world toward more of a unified and cooperative society. So despite the fears of fundamentalists that believing in evolution will destroy religion and lead to chaos and injustice, evolution could actually help with the competition between religions to help people honor religion and put religion in its proper place in their lives and in our communities, and therefore enliven religion for what it's best at and what it's most helpful for. It can call us to care for one another and the earth because we're all one, We are co-creators with incredible responsibility, and it encourages us to work towards greater and greater cooperation as a means of survival. Because the story has been consistent that the organisms that are able to continue to grow in cooperation and complexity are the ones that survive. We don't need to be building walls. We need to be building bridges. This summer when I was hiking up in the mountains of Colorado, I looked at the majestic peaks and all the old rocks, and these rocks had been there for hundreds of millions of years, and I know that they'll be here for hundreds of millions of years after I'm gone. I could feel how inconsequential I am in the scheme of things. But at the same time, I realized as insignificant as we are, on one level, in another way, it's incredible what we can do with the time that we have on this earth. My sense is that people are hungry to find ways to live in this world with an understanding of it that's based in a 21st century mindset that continues to value culture and religion and all the beauty and music and things that are created by religion and culture, but also that makes sense to us. And people want to live a moral life, and they're looking for communities like this one where people can get together, we can continue to learn and grow and celebrate and raise our children both with respect for religion, understanding about religion and what it's good for and what it helps us with, but also with a strong sense of science and knowledge and what matters the most. We are that kind of community. And this year, in 2017, let us honor our ancestors by shining even more brightly. As you look at these amazing images from the Hubble telescope, remember that we are some of the first human beings to ever see these images. And as you see them, consider that they are your ancestors. You came from them. They have formed themselves into your unique personality for some small period of time. As you start this new year, consider what you're co-creating with your precious and miraculous life. Amen.